They never wanted this to get out. For decades, the US Navy kept one quiet assumption. Only the strongest superpowers produce elite sailors. But then something happened. Something so unexpected, so statistically impossible, that top-ranking officials were forced to break their silence. New classified data leaked, and it exposed a truth the world was never prepared to hear. Filipinos aren't just contributing to America's naval strength, they're quietly redefining it, and the moment this truth surfaced, everything changed. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. For decades, the US Navy lived by an unspoken rule, a quiet belief baked so deep into the American military system that nobody ever bothered to question it. Superpowers build the world's best sailors. Strength, discipline, precision, intelligence, resilience, all of it, according to the old blueprint, belonged to nations with unmatched budgets, unmatched training, unmatched technology. The United States assumed that the backbone of its naval operations must come from Americans themselves. Why wouldn't they? They had the aircraft carriers, the destroyers, the submarines, the nuclear power, the Pentagon, the global reach. Filipinos? In Washington's eyes, they were helpful, reliable, hardworking, but never considered central, never considered critical, never considered irreplaceable. That's the hidden rule. But every rule breaks, and this one shattered in a way so dramatic that even top-ranking US officials admitted they couldn't believe what the data showed. The first crack appeared inside a classified Naval Logistics Command audit, a quiet internal performance review comparing over 40 nationalities who served, support, or contribute to U.S. naval operations worldwide. The purpose was simple: identify which workforces performed best under pressure, who kept calm under chaos, who adapted fastest during emergencies, who made the fewest critical errors during long deployments, who carried the crew's morale when missions pushed the limits of exhaustion. The analysts expected typical results. Americans first, perhaps Japanese partners, maybe South Koreans. But what the system spit out didn't match any assumption they had. Filipinos didn't just rank high, they dominated categories the US Navy considered nearly impossible to excel in all at once. Crisis adaptability, rapid technical learning, morale stabilization, high performance consistency under sleep deprivation, and the most controversial metric of all, lowest mission equity rate across long-term operations. The analysts thought it was a glitch. They ran the data again, same result. They ran it a third time, the gap widened. Filipino performance metrics weren't just good, they were outperforming several national groups on tasks requiring precision under pressure. Some officers dismissed the findings, others called it statistically improbable, but the numbers didn't care. The truth stood firm. What made this even more uncomfortable for Washington was that this wasn't new. Dig in the naval archives going back decades and a pattern emerges. Filipinos have been quietly propping up US naval operations since the early 1900s. From cooks to mechanics, from technicians to administrative heads, from maintenance crews to essential mission support, Filipinos didn't appear in the US Navy museum walls, but without them, many of those ships wouldn't have sailed in the first place. During World War II, during the Korean War, during Vietnam, during the Persian Gulf, during counter-terror missions, Filipinos were there, working in roles the Navy now admits were mission-sustaining. Yet, America never gave them full credit. They were acknowledged, yes. Appreciated privately, yes. But recognized as essential? Never. Until now. Because when the audit landed on the desk of a senior Pentagon advisor, something happened behind closed doors. The advisor reportedly highlighted one line that shook the room. Operational stability significantly decreases in naval units lacking Filipino workforce representation. That sentence spread internally faster than expected. Commanders started comparing their past deployments. Officers recalled incidents where Filipino crew members prevented disasters, stabilized tensions, solved last-minute crises, or became the emotional glue that kept teams functioning. An admiral even confessed during a private briefing, "Pull them out and half our ships would fall into disarray." No one wanted that quote leaked, but it did. And once that happened, the story snowballed. Behind the scenes, whispers turned into confirmations. Confirmations turned into briefings. Briefings turned into quiet acknowledgments inside US military circles. But the real turning point, the moment everything snapped, came when a senior Navy official slipped during a press call. A reporter had asked about recruitment shortages affecting American ships. The official sighed, paused, then accidentally said what the Pentagon had avoided admitting for decades. If it weren't for the Filipino workforce, half our global missions would be compromised. The room went silent. Reporters froze. The statement was not planned, not approved, not scripted, but it happened, and it spread like wildfire. The Filipinos didn't just help the US Navy. Filipinos sustained it. Filipinos stabilized it. Filipinos prevented collapse during manpower shortages the government still refuses to publicly talk about. It was the first time in U.S. naval history that a high-ranking officer publicly acknowledged dependence, not partnership, not cooperation, but dependence on a foreign nationality. And that's when everything shifted. But why Filipinos? Why them, not others? Why did the data point to a single group outperforming expectations in categories the US military considers vital for mission survival? That's the part Washington is still trying to wrap its head around. Because once you dig deeper, you discover something the world has ignored for too long, a set of cultural, historical, emotional, and psychological strengths that Filipinos carry into every mission, every deployment, every crew. Strengths no textbook can teach, no academy can replicate, no AI system can replace. And the US Navy is finally admitting it. That's right, the Navy has been undervaluing. We're running out of talent, and the US Navy is finally admitting. Before we unpack the shocking core of that revelation, I want you, watching this video right now, to drop the word respect in the comments. Not as a slogan, not as a trend, but as a statement of truth. Because what comes next isn't just surprising, it's a reminder of why the world keeps underestimating Filipinos, and why the data keeps proving everyone wrong. The moment the Navy's internal audit leaked, everything the US believed about its own military workforce began to unravel. Because once the commanders looked closer, a pattern started popping up in places they never expected. From nuclear-powered vessels to humanitarian missions to high-stress operations where one mistake could cost millions of dollars or hundreds of lives. Again and again, one group showed up as the stabilizing force when missions were on the brink of collapse. Filipinos weren't just performing well, they were preventing failure. This became painfully obvious during a naval readiness review in the Pacific Fleet. A destroyer stationed near Guam had been struggling with crew tension, technical setbacks, and fatigue. Command wanted answers, but when analysts reviewed the ship's performance timeline, they noticed something strange. Readiness levels dropped sharply only after a rotation removed a cluster of Filipino specialists who had been on board for years. When those workers returned in a later cycle, performance stabilized again, almost instantly. One admiral actually said, "It's almost like flipping a switch." This annoyed some officers because it contradicted everything they had been trained to believe. How could a group of foreign-born workers outperform fully trained American personnel in the most unpredictable naval environments? That was the transgression. It violated the superpower assumption, and once the rule was broken, more cracks appeared. Within the Naval Medical Command, Filipino corpsmen were consistently ranking among the highest in crisis decision-making. At the Naval Supply Systems Command, Filipino logisticians were taking the lead on complex workflows others struggled with. In ship galleys, Filipino cooks weren't just making food. They were preventing morale breakdowns on missions known for emotional strain. At the Naval Sea Systems Command, Filipino engineers were solving technical issues faster than expected, often using improvisation skills the Navy didn't even think to train for. Every time analysts tried to dismiss the findings, more proof surfaced. One psychological study conducted quietly in San Diego revealed something that shocked researchers. During long missions, crews with higher numbers of Filipino personnel suffered significantly lower mental burnout. Not because Filipinos didn't feel stress, but because their presence lowered everyone else's stress. Someone in the research briefing even asked, "So, are Filipinos the natural stabilizers of the fleet?" The room laughed, but the data said yes. And that's when the Navy realized this wasn't just about skills, it was about something deeper, something cultural, emotional, human, something the US military never measured because it didn't know how. Filipino workers brought qualities that the Navy's rigid training systems couldn't fabricate. Adaptability rooted in real-world survival, patience forged in hardship, community instinct developed in families that had learned to endure storms, poverty, separation, sacrifice, a calmness that didn't come from textbooks, but from life. And this was the turning point. The moment the US Navy understood, Filipinos weren't outperforming by accident. They were outperforming because the world had ignored the origins of their strength. But this is where the story gets even more uncomfortable. Because while the US Navy was discovering all this, another problem was rising, a problem no one wanted to admit. America is facing a historic military recruitment shortage. Young Americans are no longer lining up to enlist. Enrollment has fallen almost 30% in some branches. Fewer people want to serve at sea. Fewer want long deployments. fewer want the sacrifice. The US Navy is quietly drowning in manpower shortages, and do you know who's been holding the line for decades? Filipinos. Not just through active enlistment, not just through civilian roles, through generational presence. Filipinos who served, whose children joined, whose relatives worked inside the system, creating a chain of stability America didn't notice until now. This explains why the Pentagon panicked when the audit results surfaced. It wasn't just admiration, it was fear. Fear that the US Navy had begun to rely so heavily on Filipinos that losing them, even slightly, would cripple multiple operations. One official actually said during a secure briefing, if Filipinos stop coming to the Navy, our Pacific operations will suffer immediate degradation. Another admitted, we have no replacement for them. None. That word, none, hit harder in the Pentagon than anyone expected. And yet, even with all this information, the US Navy struggled to answer one question. Why do Filipinos perform so well in environments designed to break people? Why do they deliver under chaos without losing humanity? Why are they the emotional backbone of multinational crews? To understand, the Navy turned to its own archives, interviews, mission logs, psychological analyses, deployment reviews, and found the same insight repeated across decades. Filipinos bring stability because they bring heart, not the cliche, sugar-coated kind often thrown around in speeches, but real heart. The kind that keeps a ship functional when leadership is cracking, when exhaustion hits the breaking point, when fear sinks into the Navy realized something uncomfortable. You can't train heart. You can train skill, you can train discipline, but you can't train calmness in the face of chaos. You can't train the instinct to hold people together. You can't train the emotional intelligence needed to make a crew feel human in the middle of the ocean. Filipinos arrived with those traits built in. This became overwhelmingly clear in one internal case study about a near disaster aboard a supply vessel in the Arabian Sea. Electrical systems failed. Tension rose. A junior officer panicked. The situation could have escalated into loss of control, but according to the mission report, a Filipino technician stepped in, stabilized the team emotionally, rerouted the repair sequence, and prevented escalation, all before the commanding officer even arrived. That technician later said, "I just did what needed to be done," but the report said something else. He prevented a chain failure that could have jeopardized the mission. This was one of dozens of similar incidents that, as this information reached higher circles, something began to happen. Admiration shifted into respect, and respect shifted into concern, because the US Navy realized it wasn't just observing Filipino excellence, it was depending on it more than it ever intended to. The transgression was complete. The old rule collapsed, and the US was forced to face a truth it had ignored for too long. Before we move into the most explosive part of this story, the revelation that finally made the US Navy admit what Filipinos truly mean to global security, I want you to drop the word loyalty. Because what comes next isn't just surprising, it's the part that shows why Filipinos changed the US Navy forever, and why no superpower can replace them. The deeper US officials dug, the more uncomfortable the truth became, because the Navy didn't just uncover Filipino excellence, it uncovered dependence, quiet, unspoken, decades-long dependence that no one wanted to admit publicly. Not until the data forced their hand, not until the stories became impossible to hide, not until the US Navy realized something no superpower ever wants to acknowledge. A massive part of its strength wasn't American at all, it was Filipino. The real turning point came after a confidential fleet readiness simulation inside the Pacific Command. The Navy ran multiple war game scenarios, analyzing how ships would perform under different personnel configurations. They ran the numbers with standard American staffing, they ran the numbers with mixed international crews, and then someone on the research team proposed something unusual. What if we remove Filipinos from the simulation entirely? The room laughed. Then they tried it, and the results left the entire command silent. Every scenario that removed Filipino personnel, from technicians to medics, from supply specialists to civilian workers, collapsed faster than analysts expected. Tasks failed, repairs slowed, morale broke, mission effectiveness plummeted. The Pacific Fleet, America's most important naval defense line, saw dramatic drops in operational stability when Filipinos were removed from the equation. One admiral said, "This can't be right. Run it again." They did, same result. They ran it 4 more times. The report didn't change. For the first time in US naval history, America was forced to confront a truth they never expected. Filipinos weren't supporting the system, Filipinos were sustaining it. But the real shock wasn't the simulation, it was the reaction inside the Pentagon. Internal memos show that several officials began questioning America's long-term readiness strategy. If Filipino presence was that crucial, what happened if immigration slowed? What if global competition got stronger? What if other nations started actively recruiting Filipino talent on a massive scale? Spoiler, they already are. Japan, South Korea, Canada, Australia, and the UK have all increased recruitment of Filipino workers in critical sectors. And military analysts warned, if civilian Filipino manpower decreases in the US Navy system, mission readiness will decline over the next decade. A senior defense official reportedly said, "We always knew Filipinos were good. We just didn't realize how much we needed them." That sentence became the unofficial anthem of the entire revelation. This triggered another uncomfortable discussion. Why Filipinos? What is it about them that no training manual, no academy, no advanced AI simulation can replicate? The revelation wasn't political, it wasn't cultural, it wasn't even emotional. It was biological, psychological, and historical all at once. Filipinos excel in environments of unpredictability because unpredictability shaped them. Typhoons, earthquakes, overseas labor, poverty, migration, sacrifice. Those aren't weaknesses. They're adaptive training grounds. Filipinos didn't gain resilience in classrooms, they gained it in life. And that resilience translated into something the US Navy couldn't engineer: emotional intelligence under crisis, patience during uncertainty, harmony in high-pressure teamwork, the bravery to step in when others freeze, the humility to work without demanding credit, the instinct to hold people together when leadership falters. You can't train that, you can't simulate that, you can't replace that. This explains why ships with more Filipino crew remain calmer, why systems stay functional longer, why teamwork stays tight during mission fatigue, why conflict inside crews decreases. The US Navy didn't just expose a statistic, they exposed a psychological truth. Filipinos are the emotional stabilizers of the fleet. They are the human architecture inside America's naval machine. But here's where the story shifts again, and this time it gets political. When the Navy's findings reached Capitol Hill, several members of Congress were stunned. One congressman reportedly said, "If these numbers are accurate, we owe the Filipino community more than thanks. We owe them national security acknowledgement." Another asked, "Has the US been severely underestimating Filipino contributions for over a century?" Then a senator from Hawaii delivered the most unexpected statement: "Filipinos are already a recognized part of our military story. It's time we admit they're a pillar of it." That comment set off a cascade of reactions. Editorials, think tank discussions, policy proposals, military podcasts, global analysts weighing in. Suddenly, the story wasn't just the Navy admitting the truth, it was America confronting the possibility that Filipinos aren't just helpers, not contributors, not supporters, but protectors of US power projection in the Pacific. The revelation didn't just surprise Americans, it surprised the world. Because if the US Navy, the strongest Navy on earth, depends on Filipinos more than any other nationality, what does that say about Filipinos globally? What does it say about their role across industries, across allies, across diplomatic ties, across humanitarian work, across peacekeeping, across global labor systems? And here's the twist the Pentagon didn't expect. After the report circulated, several allied nations reached out to US officials with one quiet question. If America depends on Filipinos this much, how can we secure more of them for our own operations? That's when US officials realized the situation had evolved from discovery into competition. The world sees what America sees, and the race to secure Filipino talent has officially begun. But there's one more revelation, the one the Navy didn't want public, the one buried deep in the final pages of the audit, the line that explains everything. If Filipino workforce participation declines, US naval operational stability will face significant long-term risk. The US military, the world's strongest, quietly admitting its vulnerability. And that vulnerability is tied to one nationality, one people, one community, Filipinos. Before we wrap up this chapter, because trust me, the story is only getting started, I need every Filipino watching this and every ally who respects them to drop the word unbreakable in the comments. Not as a trend, but as a reminder that the world's biggest military superpower is finally saying what Filipinos have known all along. When it truly matters, when the pressure is highest, when the stakes are life and death, Filipinos deliver. And if you want to take this deeper, the geopolitical angle, the recruitment crisis, the Pacific threat environment, the global race for Filipino skill, join our membership because mainstream media won't talk about this. Governments won't admit it publicly, but inside our members-only content, we break down the hidden stories, the suppressed data, and the global patterns shaping the Philippines' future. Membership isn't just support, it's access. Access to understanding the bigger picture, access to the truth the world isn't ready to broadcast. Because if the US Navy just admitted this much, imagine what they haven't said yet.